It is Halloween night, 2016. The woods of Bear Creek Township in Luzerne County, Pennsylvania, are the kind of place that feels like the earth is holding its breath. The trees stand bare. The sky is the color of old ash. Two hunters are moving through the brush, their boots crunching over leaves that have long gone cold. They are not looking for anything unusual. They have walked these trails before. They know this land. They are looking for deer. And then they see it. Scattered along the ground and in bags, partially concealed by the dead leaves and the dark, are human remains, body parts, the remains of a child. They stop. One of them reaches for his phone. His hands are shaking, not from the cold. The call goes into 911, and within hours, the woods of Bear Creek Township become the center of one of the most disturbing criminal investigations in the history of Pennsylvania. Because what the investigators would soon uncover is not just a murder. It is a story of something far more calculated, far more methodical, and far more evil than anything that could be born in a single moment of rage. This was planned. This was deliberate. This had been years in the making. The victim was a 14-year-old girl named Grace Packer, and the people who killed her were not strangers who lurked in the dark. They were the two people who were supposed to love her most. One of them had legally adopted her. One of them had promised, through the machinery of the state child welfare system, to give her a permanent home. Grace Packer did not die quickly. She did not die without knowing what was happening to her, and she was not mourned by the people who destroyed her. Her adoptive mother, Sara Packer, later told a jury in a flat, emotionless voice that Grace had become, in her words, a non-entity, that she had wanted her to go away. And in July 2016, Sara Packer and her boyfriend, Jacob Sullivan, made sure that she did. This is Grace's story, all of it. Before there was Grace, there was Susan. Susan Hunsaker was born on August 14, 2001. Her biological family, Rose and Rodney Hunsaker, were residents of the Reading area of Berks County, Pennsylvania. The Hunsakers were not wealthy people. They lived in modest circumstances, and by all accounts they loved their children. But loving your children and being equipped to protect them from every danger that surrounds them are two entirely different things. The home was crowded. The family was low income. And in the web of adult relationships that surrounded that household, there were people who posed a genuine danger to the children inside it. Rose and Rodney Hunsaker had 3 children. The youngest 2 were Susan, who was born in 2001, and her brother, born about 2 years later. When reports of abuse began filtering into Berks County's child welfare system, abuse perpetrated not by Rose and Rodney themselves, but by other adults with access to the children in that home, the county began proceedings to remove the children. Rose and Rodney Hunsaker fought back. They went through the hearings, through the evaluations, through every step of the legal process trying to keep their family together. But a Berks County judge ultimately terminated their parental rights. The children were removed. Years later, sitting across from a journalist, Rose Hunsaker would describe the moment she found out what had happened to Grace as the worst day of her life. She had trusted the system. She had trusted that the system was placing her children somewhere safer than the home they had been taken from. "I trusted this woman," Rose would later say, speaking of Sara Packer, the woman who had taken her children in. The sentence hangs there, full of the kind of grief that has nowhere left to go. Susan and her baby brother were placed in foster care as a sibling group, and eventually they were adopted together. Susan was around 3 years old when she was first placed in the Packer household. Her brother was around 1. The woman who took them in was a Northampton County adoptions worker, someone who worked within the very system that had placed these children. Her name was Sara Packer. Her husband's name was David Packer. The placement began around 2004, and the adoption was not formally finalized until March 2007, when Grace was approximately 5 years old. And when the adoption was finalized, Susan was renamed. She became Grace. It should have been the beginning of something better. It was not. Grace grew into a child who, by every account of people who knew her outside that house, was remarkable for her warmth. Former classmates and teachers remembered her as someone who had a particular instinct for the loneliest kids in any room. If there was a child sitting alone at lunch, Grace would sit with them. If there was a child being left out at recess, Grace would notice. For someone who had already endured so much upheaval in her short life, she had developed a capacity for empathy that should have been nurtured, not extinguished. Inside the Packer home, things were different. To understand what happened to Grace Packer, you have to understand what kind of person Sara Packer was long before Jacob Sullivan ever entered the picture. Because the portrait that emerged after Grace's death was not of a woman who had suddenly snapped or been led astray by a dangerous man or lost her mind in some tragic breakdown. The portrait was of a woman who had been building toward this for years. Sara Packer worked as an adoption supervisor at the Northampton County Office of Children, Youth and Families. On her job application, she had written that she wanted a career working with children in order to make a difference and to benefit my fellow human. She described fostering children as very rewarding, saying it had given her the opportunity to open my home and heart to many children. She was, on paper, and in many face-to-face interactions with colleagues and caseworkers, the picture of a dedicated public servant who had brought that dedication home with her. Between the year 2000 and 2010, Sara and David Packer fostered 30 children. 30. Over the course of a decade, they moved around northeastern Pennsylvania hopscotching, as one report put it, from county to county, and in each place, they took in foster children. Children with histories of trauma, children with special needs, children who the system had decided needed somewhere stable to land. And Sara Packer was the kind of person who knew exactly how to present herself to that system. She worked inside it. She understood its language, its paperwork, its blind spots. Former foster children who lived in that home would later tell journalists and investigators a very different story about what life inside the Packer house was actually like. They described an environment where abuse was not the exception. It was the routine, emotional abuse, physical abuse, and something far worse. One former foster daughter described Sara watching episodes of the forensic crime series CSI and making offhand remarks about how she would dismember a body if she ever needed to get rid of one. This girl was a child at the time. She thought it was a strange joke. She filed it away. It would only make sense much later. Grace and her biological brother were not just passing through. They were permanently adopted. That distinction matters, because it meant that even as the foster care pipeline into the Packer home was eventually shut down, and it would be, dramatically and publicly, Grace and her brother remained. There was no mechanism to automatically review the suitability of adoptive parents the way there might be for foster placements under active agency supervision. Once the adoption was finalized, the parental rights of Sara and David Packer over Grace were legally equivalent to those of any biological parent. The state had handed her over, and then the state largely stepped away. By 2010, that decision would reveal itself to be catastrophic. Sara Packer claimed, in the course of court proceedings, to have an IQ of over 140, a number she offered from the witness stand, though it was never independently verified or tested during the legal process. What is documented is that she was, by any professional measure, a highly intelligent woman who had built a career around understanding the vulnerabilities of children and navigating the bureaucracies designed to protect them. That intelligence and that knowledge did not protect Grace. They were the very tools used against her. The first major fracture in the Packer household became public in 2010. A foster teenager who had been living with the family came forward with a report that changed everything, or should have. The teenager told authorities that she had discovered photographs on David Packer's phone, photographs of him committing SA against another foster child in the home. The police were called. An investigation was opened. What they found was worse than the initial report. David Packer had been sexually abusing a 15-year-old foster daughter in the home. She had initially reported that the sexual contact began when she was 18, but as the investigation deepened, it emerged that the abuse had in fact started when she was 15, meaning it had been going on for years before it came to light. He was arrested in Allentown, where the family was then living, and charged with statutory rape and indecent assault. In the course of the investigation, it also emerged that he had committed the same crimes against Grace, the girl who had been placed in this man's home as a toddler and formally adopted at age 5. David Packer pleaded guilty and was sentenced to between 6 months and 5 years in prison, serving the bulk of that term before his release. Sara Packer was not charged. Prosecutors at the time acknowledged that what she had tolerated or participated in allowing was, in the words of one official, reprehensible. But it did not, at that point, rise to the level of criminal conduct they could prove in court. She was suspended from her position as adoption supervisor at Northampton County in 2010, officially, on allegations of misconduct, and she never returned to that role. She lost her license to foster children. The state revoked that authorization entirely. But Grace and her brother stayed with Sara. Think about that for a moment. A woman who had worked inside the child welfare system. A woman who had just watched her husband go to prison for repeatedly essaying children in her own home, including her adopted daughter. A woman who had been removed from her position overseeing other people's children. That woman was allowed to keep those 2 children. One of them, a direct victim of the abuse that had just sent her husband to prison, because the legal threshold for removing an adopted child from a parent is considerably higher than the threshold for removing a foster child. Child welfare authorities reportedly noted that they would not conduct additional welfare checks unless a new complaint was filed. As adoptive parent, Sara Packer had the same legal standing as any biological mother. So Grace stayed. And for the next several years, Grace's life was a carousel of instability. At some point around 2014 or 2015, she went to live with a relative in Burke County, North Carolina. The circumstances that led to that arrangement are captured in the Child Fatality Review Report that Pennsylvania's Department of Human Services later released. A heavily redacted document that nonetheless tells the story of a girl who was already flagging distress signals to every adult system around her, and of agencies that were either not listening or not talking to each other. When Grace returned from North Carolina to Pennsylvania in the fall of 2015, she came back to a home that now included a new man in Sara Packer's life, a man named Jacob Sullivan, and it was around this time that Sara and Sullivan began to plot her murder. Jacob Sullivan moved into the Packer home in 2013. Court records from his January 2017 arraignment placed him at 44 years old at that time, and he was 46 at the time of his sentencing in March 2019, which puts him in his early 40s when he first entered Grace's life. He and Sara Packer were close in age. Not much is publicly known about Sullivan's background before entering Grace's life, but what emerged through court proceedings and investigative reporting painted the picture of a man who found in Sara Packer not a redemptive love, but a confirmation of his own darkest impulses. Bucks County District Attorney Matthew Weintraub, in laying out the case to the jury during Sullivan's sentencing, described the relationship between Sara Packer and Jacob Sullivan as one built around a shared and mutually reinforcing fantasy, a fantasy involving rape and murder. It was not a fantasy that Sullivan introduced to an unwilling Sara, nor one that Sara had forced upon a reluctant Sullivan. Both of them, prosecutors argued, wanted the same thing. And they found in each other the one person willing to go all the way. The defense team, for their part, tried a different narrative. They argued that Sara was the mastermind, the one who had the insider knowledge and the dominant personality. They argued that Sullivan was manipulated, controlled, led into something he might not have arrived at on his own. The jury didn't buy it. But there was a grain of procedural truth embedded in the defense's argument, in that the physical evidence against Sara Packer was considerably more limited than the evidence against Sullivan, because it was Sullivan who physically committed the acts. Sara's role was one of planning, facilitation, and witness, and at the moment of Grace's death, she was holding her daughter's hand. The relationship between Sullivan and Grace in the years between 2013 and 2016 has been described by those aware of the home environment as deeply troubling. Grace was an adolescent coming into her teenage years in a household where the adult male figure was someone whose relationship with her mother was, at its core, built on a fantasy that centered on her own destruction. She had no idea. No 14-year-old could have known. What is documented is that the planning began in earnest in the fall of 2015, when Grace returned from North Carolina. At that point, Sullivan and Sara had been together for over 2 years. The house was in Abington, Montgomery County. Grace was 14. Her brother, Grace's adopted sibling who had come from the same biological family, was living in the home as well, at approximately 12 years old. And according to the timeline established by prosecutors and Sullivan's own later confession, it was in those months between fall 2015 and the summer of 2016 that the two of them sat down and decided exactly how they were going to kill her. There was also a financial dimension to this. It was not the primary motive, but it was a motive. Sara Packer was receiving $712 a month in disability payments on behalf of Grace. As long as Grace was alive, or as long as the state believed Grace was alive, that money kept coming in. After Grace disappeared and Sara reported her as a runaway, Sara continued collecting that money. Between July 1, 2016 and November 10, 2016, while her daughter was dead and dismembered and dumped in the woods, Sara Packer spent more than $3,600 of disability funding intended for Grace. She also completed a continuing disability review report on August 22, 2016, never once disclosing that her daughter had been missing for over a month. In Sara Packer's world, Grace was already a nonentity. The administrative paperwork of her existence was just something to be managed. July 4, 2016. There is a family picnic in Lehigh County. Grace Packer is there. She is 14 years old and she is going to turn 15 in August. She is laughing, eating, surrounded by people who would later recall that day with an anguish they will carry for the rest of their lives, because none of them knew it was the last time they would ever see her alive. Nobody flagged anything unusual. Nobody took her aside and asked if she was okay. Nobody had any idea. Grace was present, and then Grace was gone, and the family picnic photographs became evidence. 4 days later, on July 8, 2016, Sara Packer and Jacob Sullivan told Grace they were taking her to their new home in Quakertown, Bucks County. The house was rented and vacant. The kind of house where nobody would hear anything. The kind of house that had been chosen for exactly that reason. What happened in that house over the following 2 days is drawn from Sullivan's own confession, from Sara Packer's courtroom testimony, from physical evidence collected by investigators, and from the prosecutor's detailed presentation at Sullivan's sentencing hearing. It is among the most disturbing accounts to come out of a Pennsylvania courtroom in recent memory, and it was disturbing not merely because of the acts themselves, but because of how deliberate every single element of it was. They had brought supplies, zip ties, a ball gag, pills, over-the-counter medication that they had calibrated or tried to calibrate into a dosage they believed would kill a 14-year-old girl. They had already identified the attic in this rented, vacant house as the place where it would happen. The attic was sweltering. It was July in Pennsylvania, and there was no air conditioning, and the heat in that enclosed space would have been overwhelming. Sullivan graped Grace while Sara watched. He then punched her in the face. They bound her hands and feet with zip ties. They stuffed the ball gag in her mouth. They gave her the pills, the overdose they had planned to be lethal. And then they left her in that attic, in the heat, bound, gagged, drugged to die. They went home. Grace did not die. At some point during those hours, alone, in a sweltering attic, Barely conscious, injured, terrified, Grace managed to spit out the gag. She worked at the zip ties. She did not fully free herself. She was 14 years old and she had been drugged and beaten, and she was fighting to stay alive in a place that had been designed to be her grave. But she was still breathing when Sara and Sullivan returned the following morning. July 9, 2016. They came back after approximately 12 hours. They climbed the attic stairs and they found her still alive. Jacob Sullivan strangled Grace to death. Sara Packer was with him, and according to the testimony Sara gave at Sullivan's sentencing hearing, she was holding Grace's hand when it happened. She told her daughter in those final moments, "It's okay to go." She told her, "I can't help you anymore." The judge presiding over Sullivan's sentencing hearing later said that the butchery in this case was beyond my ability to describe. She thanked the jurors for being able to sit through what they were shown, the photographs, the recordings, the tapes. And Judge Diane Gibbons said that she believed we had all let Grace down. Those words, "we all let Grace down," would echo through the subsequent months and years of investigations, reports, and legal proceedings as the full scope of the system's failure came into focus. Grace Packer was dead. Her body was in an attic, and Sara Packer and Jacob Sullivan had a problem, or rather, they had several, and they had anticipated most of them. On July 11, 2016, just 2 days after Grace's death, Sullivan and Sara purchased a bow saw. According to investigators and prosecutors, the body was stored in the attic, packed in cat litter for a period of months while Sara and Sullivan decided what to do next, and while they worked to cover their tracks with the outside world. On the same day they bought the saw, Sara Packer filed a missing person report with Abington Township Police. She told police that Grace had run away, that there had been an argument, that Grace had just taken off. She described her daughter as a troubled teenager who had a history of running away, and there were enough entries in Grace's child welfare file, enough documented periods of instability, that this story was not immediately dismissed. Police began treating it as a runaway case. The cover story bought them time. Police in Montgomery County began looking for Grace as a missing teenager, not a murder victim. They put out appeals. They asked the public for help. They did the things you do when a teenage girl goes missing, and the assumption is that she left under her own power. For weeks, nothing came back. No sightings, no tips that panned out, no Grace. Sara, meanwhile, had moved. She relocated from Abington to Quakertown, to the same area where the vacant murder house was located, without notifying police of her new address. She enrolled Grace's younger brother in the Quakertown school district, but did not enroll Grace. When investigators eventually reached out to the school district in September 2016, they found that Grace had been withdrawn from Abington's school records, but there was no indication of any plans to enroll her anywhere else. She had been erased from the administrative record, just as she had been erased from Sara Packer's life. Investigators made numerous attempts to contact Sara Packer through August and into September of 2016. She was uncooperative. She moved without informing police. She filed paperwork about Grace as if Grace were still alive and in her care. She collected money intended for her dead daughter. On August 22, 2016, more than 6 weeks after Grace was dead, Sara completed a continuing disability review report on Grace's behalf and submitted it to the Social Security Administration without a single word about her daughter's disappearance. September 7, 2016, investigators officially confirmed that Grace and her brother had been withdrawn from Abington School District. The case began to shift. What had been treated as a runaway inquiry was starting to look like something else entirely. And all this time, somewhere in Pennsylvania, the remains of a 14-year-old girl were stored in cat litter, waiting. The dismemberment happened at some point before the remains were transported. Sullivan later admitted that he and Sara, increasingly afraid they would be caught, made the decision to dismember Grace's body using the bow saw they had purchased. He told investigators the details in a confession that prosecutors described as one of the most disturbing documents they had ever had to read. The remains were then taken to Bear Creek Township in Luzerne County, a remote wooded area, and left there, discarded. Like garbage. The distance between Quakertown and Bear Creek Township is not large, roughly an hour's drive, through the kind of rural Pennsylvania landscape that people pass through without ever stopping. The woods there are dense. The roads are isolated. It was a place chosen for concealment, and it worked until October 31, 2016, when two hunters walked into those woods and found what Sara Packer and Jacob Sullivan had left behind. The call to 911 from the Luzerne County woods went in on Halloween night, 2016. By November 8, 2016, the remains had been positively identified as Grace Packer. For the investigators who had been looking for a missing 14-year-old girl for nearly 4 months, that identification landed like a confirmation of everything they had feared, but refused to fully believe until that moment. The revelation changed the legal landscape entirely. What had been a missing person investigation out of Montgomery County was now a homicide. The Bucks County District Attorney's Office, along with Montgomery County authorities, began converging on the case with a new urgency. Sara Packer, who had been hovering at the edges of the investigation as a person of interest, was about to move to the center of it. On November 12, 2016, Sara Packer was arrested and jailed in Montgomery County. The initial charges were child endangerment and obstruction of the administration of law, not yet murder. Police needed more before they could file those charges. They needed a confession, corroborating physical evidence, or both. The investigation was still building. December 21, 2016, Sara was held for trial on those initial charges. 2 days later, on December 23, she was released on bail. She went home. Or rather, she went back to whatever home still existed, because by that point the ground under her life was dissolving. The case was getting public attention. People who knew her, people who had worked with her, former foster children who had lived in her home, they were talking. And then came December 30, 2016. On that day, police publicly asked for the community's help in solving Grace's case. They put out an appeal asking anyone with information to come forward. The case was now officially being described as a homicide. Sara Packer and Jacob Sullivan were both aware that the net was closing. That same day, the two of them made a suicide pact. Sullivan obtained prescription pills. They took them together, an overdose, a shared exit from what they had built together and what it had now become. A woman who lived with them found them unresponsive and called for help. Both were rushed to the hospital. Both survived. And in the hospital, surrounded by medical staff and the particular stripped-down vulnerability of a person who has just tried to die, Jacob Sullivan started talking. In the early days of January 2017, Sullivan admitted to hospital staffers that he was responsible for Grace's death. He did not give a full account immediately. That would come in subsequent interviews with investigators, but what he said in that hospital room was enough. He told them what had happened. He began to describe the events of July 8 and 9. He implicated Sara. He implicated himself. He began the process that would eventually take him to a death row cell in a Pennsylvania prison. On January 8, 2017, Jacob Sullivan was formally charged with first-degree murder, rape, kidnapping, and a suite of related offenses. Later the same day, Sara Packer was also charged with murder and related counts. The Bucks County District Attorney, Matthew Weintraub, stood before the cameras and said that what these two people had done was among the most depraved acts he had encountered in his career. And he noted with specificity that the motive had not been purely about fantasy. The motive was also money. Their motive to perpetuate the lie that she was still alive was profit, greed, Weintraub said. It was for the money that they could collect because of her life and very existence. Grace's biological mother, Rose Hunsaker, heard about the charges from reading. She sat with journalists and talked about how she had trusted the system. about how she had believed her children were safe, about how she thought she had done the hardest thing, the thing that had broken her heart, and given them a better chance, only to find out that the better chance she thought she had given them was a lie. Before we get to the courtroom, it is worth pausing here, because the story of Grace Packer is not just the story of two monsters. It is the story of a child who touched the child welfare system of Pennsylvania and one county in North Carolina at virtually every point of her life. And at virtually every one of those points, the system failed her. The Pennsylvania Department of Human Services eventually released a child fatality review report in connection with Grace's case. It is a heavily redacted document. Many names and specific details are blacked out in the public version, but even in its redacted form, it is devastating reading. The report's timeline spans nearly the entirety of Grace's 14 years. It begins with her removal from the Hunsaker home, follows her placement with the Packers, traces every subsequent interaction with every county child welfare agency that touched her case, and identifies what it calls a multitude of missed opportunities. The counties involved were Berks, Lehigh, and Montgomery in Pennsylvania, as well as Burke County in North Carolina. 4 separate jurisdictions, 4 separate agencies, and across all of them the recurring theme is the same. Information was not shared. Warning signs were minimized. Services provided to Grace were described as ineffective. When one county closed a case, they did not adequately brief the next county that picked it up. Consider the specific failure of 2010 alone. David Packer pleaded guilty to SAEing Grace when she was a young child and went to prison for it. Sara Packer was suspended from her job working with vulnerable children. Sara's foster license was revoked, and yet Grace remained in Sara's home. The reasoning, as later explained by child welfare officials, was that adoptive parents have the legal equivalent of biological parental rights, and that absent a new complaint, there was no mechanism to initiate an automatic review of Grace's placement. That reasoning may be technically defensible. It is also, in retrospect, an indictment of the system's design. Think about what Grace was living through in that period. Her adoptive father had just pleaded guilty to graping her. She was growing up in the home of the woman who had watched it happen, and who had, as it later emerged, potentially known it was happening. She had no father figure in the home, no advocate with any real power, no caseworker conducting regular visits. She had, in a very real sense, been handed to Sara Packer and then left there. There was a period when Grace was sent to live with relatives in Burke County, North Carolina. The child fatality reports section on this period is among the most pointed in the document. Burke County's Child Welfare Agency, when made aware that Grace was struggling in that placement and that the caretakers could no longer manage her, apparently did not treat the situation as an abandonment or a safety concern. They located Sara Packer, and without conducting a proper assessment of the Packer home or utilizing the legal process known as the Interstate Compact, which exists precisely to ensure that children being transported across state lines go to verified safe environments, they simply arranged for Sara to drive to North Carolina and pick Grace up. They closed their own case. The Pennsylvania agencies conducted a home check for the purpose of closing their file, not for the purpose of determining whether Grace was safe. And Grace came home. The report also identified what it described as insufficient resources for children who exhibited serious trauma-related or sexually reactive behaviors. An acknowledgement that even when the system was trying to do right by a child like Grace, it often lacked the tools to actually help her. The report did not name specific individuals who were disciplined, fired, or otherwise held accountable. It is not clear, even now, whether anyone in the child welfare system lost their job over Grace Packer's death. The agencies were scrutinized. A report was written. The report was released. Grace remained dead. The state government of Pennsylvania, through 3 counties and multiple agencies, had over a decade of contact with this child. Her name appeared in their files. Her case was documented, reviewed, and periodically escalated. And in July 2016, she died in a sweltering attic at the hands of the woman the state had certified as her permanent guardian, while every system that was supposed to protect her had already turned away and moved on. In the period between January 2017, when charges were filed, and early 2019, when the cases of both Sara Packer and Jacob Sullivan moved toward their final resolution, several significant developments shaped what the courtroom proceedings would look like. Sullivan pleaded guilty. He admitted to first-degree murder and all related charges. That plea was entered before the sentencing phase, meaning the jury would not be deciding guilt. They would be deciding punishment. The options were life in prison without parole or death. Bucks County District Attorney Matthew Weintraub, who had spent years building this case, was asking for death. Sara Packer entered a separate negotiation. She also agreed to plead guilty, but she did so in exchange for a guarantee of life in prison rather than the death penalty. The DA's office justified this arrangement on several grounds. The physical evidence against Sara was weaker than the evidence against Sullivan. It was Sullivan who had committed the physical acts of rape and strangulation. The crime Sara was charged with did not meet the specific legal threshold for the death penalty in Pennsylvania under the applicable statutes. And critically, Sara Packer agreed to testify at Sullivan's sentencing hearing. This was significant for several reasons. It meant that the jury hearing Sullivan's sentencing case would hear from the woman who had been present for everything, not filtered through a detective's summary, not reconstructed from forensic evidence, from Sara's own mouth. And so, in March 2019, nearly 3 years after Grace Packer died in that attic, the Bucks County Courthouse in Doylestown, Pennsylvania, became the scene of what many observers described as one of the most disturbing criminal proceedings they had ever witnessed. Sara Packer arrived at the courthouse wearing a red prison jumpsuit. She took the witness stand. She did not express remorse in any recognizable form. She spoke in what reporters in the courtroom described as a flat, monotone voice. The voice of someone describing events at a remove, someone whose emotional connection to what she was describing had either been severed or had never existed in the first place. She told the jury, Grace had become, for lack of a better word, a nonentity. She just didn't exist anymore. I wanted her to go away. She confirmed that she had watched Jacob Sullivan rape Grace. She confirmed that she had been present when Sullivan strangled her. She confirmed that she had been holding Grace's hand. She confirmed that she had said to her dying daughter, "It's okay to go, and I can't help you anymore." She also said, for the record, that Sullivan never forced me to do anything. The defense had argued that Sara was the mastermind and Sullivan the instrument. Sara's testimony, given as part of her plea deal, under oath, in front of the jury deciding whether Sullivan would live or die, undermined that narrative in direct terms. She did not say Sullivan coerced her. She took co-ownership of what had happened in the flattest and most terrible way possible. The gallery at the Bucks County Courthouse included family members of Grace Packer, including relatives who had known her and loved her, and who were now sitting through the detailed clinical description of her final hours. Grace's cousin Carrie Heiserer submitted a victim impact statement that was read to the court. "It sickens me to know that Grace was abused, tortured, and literally thrown away like she was a piece of trash," she said. "Grace is in a better place now, free from evil and pain." Grace's biological mother, Rose Hunsaker, sat in the courthouse and listened to testimony about the death of the child she had been told was being given a better life. The child who had been taken from her arms and placed, by the state, into Sara Packer's hands. On March 27, 2019, the jury returned its decision in the sentencing phase of Jacob Sullivan's case. Death. All 12 jurors agreed. Sullivan was 46 years old. He sat at the defense table and showed no reaction as the foreman announced the verdict. At least one juror was crying. The judge, Bucks County Judge Diane Gibbons, thanked the jury, telling them that the butchery in this case was beyond my ability to describe. She acknowledged the toll it must have taken to sit through the evidence, the photographs, the recordings, the detailed forensic presentation of what had been done to a 14-year-old girl. And then she looked at Jacob Sullivan. "You have no soul," she told him. She paused and then noted that she had never said those words to anyone before him in all her years on the bench, that she had never believed a case would bring her to that point. Sullivan had no reaction. District Attorney Weintraub, speaking outside the courthouse, was less restrained in his language. "He got what he deserved, plain and simple," Weintraub said. "Death is the appropriate sentence for this man. This man will never see the light of day. He'll never be able to prey on a child again." A juror who spoke with reporters after the verdict said the deliberations had been among the most difficult experiences of their lives. They had been shown materials that they described as haunting. They had been asked to make a decision about a human life, and they had made it unanimously. One day later, on March 28, 2019, Sara Packer stood before Judge Gibbons to enter her guilty plea and receive her sentence. She pleaded guilty to first-degree murder, kidnapping, abuse of a corpse, and related charges. The judge accepted the plea. And then Judge Gibbons did what she had done the day before. She looked at the person standing before her and she did not hold back. "Evil attracts evil," the judge said. "Evil recognizes evil, and in Jacob Sullivan you found one of your own." She continued, "You like grape, you like murder, that's a fact." She described the rot and warped depravity on display in the case. She said to Sara Packer directly, "There is no cure for people like you." Sara Packer was sentenced to life in prison. Beyond that, she received an additional 52 to 104 years on the remaining charges. She would die in prison. That was not in question. The only question had been whether the state of Pennsylvania would seek to execute her. And the answer was no, not because of any mercy towards Sara Packer, but because of the legal constraints of the evidence and the charges and the calculated decision to use her testimony to put Jacob Sullivan on death row. District Attorney Weintraub, who had shepherded this case from the moment the charges were filed in January 2017, stood outside the courthouse again. "Unfortunately, Grace Packer was a disposable child to these people," he said. "Who will now speak for Grace Packer? We will." One juror, in a statement that circulated widely after the verdict, captured what so many people who had followed this case were feeling. "We all let Grace down." It was the same phrase Judge Gibbons had used at the conclusion of Sullivan's sentencing. The judge and the juror arrived at the same 5 words independently, because those 5 words were the only honest summary of what had happened to a 14-year-old girl who had spent her entire life inside a system that was supposed to protect her. The criminal verdicts were not the end of the legal reckoning. In June 2018, attorneys filed a civil lawsuit on behalf of Grace Packer's estate against multiple Pennsylvania state and county agencies, arguing that their repeated and documented failures to act on available warning signs had directly contributed to Grace's death. The defendants included the Pennsylvania Department of Human Services and multiple county child welfare agencies, whose files on Grace stretched back years before her murder. The law firm of Saltz Mongeluzzi Bendeschi, which represented Grace's estate, announced in April 2021 that they had secured an $8.9 million settlement. The agencies, consistent with standard civil settlement practice, did not formally admit wrongdoing. But the size of the settlement and the nature of the claims that had survived the pretrial process reflected, in legal terms, something that the Child Fatality Review Report had already established in plain language, that there were systemic, institutional failures in Grace Packer's case that went far beyond the actions of 2 individual killers. Grace's biological family, who had spent years watching the state agency that separated them from their daughter be implicated in the circumstances of her death, saw the settlement as the only form of institutional accountability the legal system had to offer. It was not enough. It could never be enough. But it was, at the very least, a recognition that Grace had been failed, not just by two people who were supposed to love her, but by a system that had more than enough information and more than enough time to intervene, and had not. Jacob Sullivan spent less than 14 months on death row. On April 30, 2020, while confined at SCI Phoenix in Collegeville, Pennsylvania, Sullivan suffered a ruptured aortic aneurysm. He was taken to an outside hospital where he died. He was 47 years old. The Commonwealth of Pennsylvania had condemned him to die by lethal injection. Instead, his heart gave out before the state ever had the chance to carry out that sentence. For many of the people who had sat through his trial and his sentencing, the family members, the investigators, the courtroom observers who had endured weeks of testimony about what he had done to a 14-year-old girl in a sweltering attic, the manner of his death prompted a complicated response. Some felt robbed of the finality that an execution would have represented. Others felt that the manner of death was beside the point. Jacob Sullivan was dead. He was never going to walk free. He was never going to hurt another child. District Attorney Weintraub, when informed of Sullivan's death, noted that he had met his end in a hospital rather than by the needle, but that the outcome, permanent removal from the world, was what had always mattered. Most investigators who worked the case agreed that the death sentence had served its purpose the moment it was handed down, regardless of how it was ultimately carried out. Sara Packer, as of the time of this narration, remains in a Pennsylvania state prison, serving a sentence that will end only when she does. She is never getting out. Grace Packer lived for 14 years. She was born into poverty and instability, removed from the biological parents who loved her, placed into a home that the state certified as safe, and murdered by the woman that same state had entrusted with her life. She spent her entire existence inside systems, the child welfare system, the family court system, the foster and adoptive parent licensing system, none of which ever adequately protected her. And yet, by every account of the people who actually knew her, she had managed to become someone worth knowing, someone with warmth, someone who noticed the kids sitting alone. That is not nothing. That is, in fact, remarkable, and it is the detail about Grace Packer that tends to stay with people long after they have processed the horror of what happened to her. The violence and the cruelty are unforgettable, but they are not the whole picture. The whole picture includes a girl who had every reason to close herself off from the world and instead chose to open herself up to it. The teachers and classmates who remembered her described someone who was fighting, in her own quiet way, against everything her home life was doing to her. She did not know she was doing it. She was just being herself. And when she was gone, the people who had seen that self, however briefly, however incompletely, felt the loss of it in a way that went beyond the shock of the crime. Rose Hunsaker, Grace's biological mother, has continued to speak publicly about her daughter's case in the years since the verdicts. She has advocated for changes to the foster care and adoption oversight systems in Pennsylvania. She has sat with journalists and told them, again and again, about the child she had to give up and the child she never got the chance to know grow up. She has told them that she hopes no other family goes through what hers went through. That she hopes the people who are supposed to protect vulnerable children will actually do it. Whether the system has changed enough to honor that hope is a question that Pennsylvania's child welfare agencies are still working to answer. After Grace's death, new protocols were proposed, and some implemented changes to the way information is shared between counties, changes to how adoptive placements are monitored after finalization. Whether those changes are adequate, whether they go far enough, whether another child in another county is right now living through something that the files already know about, these are questions without clean answers. What does have a clean answer is what happened to Grace Packer. It is documented in court records, in a child fatality review report, in a civil lawsuit settlement, in a sentencing transcript where a judge told a convicted murderer that he had no soul, and in the testimony of a woman who held her dying daughter's hand and told her it was okay to go. It is all there in public documents, available for anyone to read. Grace Packer was failed at every turn, by the adults who were supposed to protect her, by the agencies that were paid to watch over her, by a system that knew her name and her file and her history and still could not, or did not save her. She deserved better, and the least we can do in telling her story is to say that clearly and not look away. If this story has moved you, take a moment to learn about foster care advocacy organizations in your area. There are children in the system right now who need consistent, reliable adults in their corner. You do not need to be a foster parent to make a difference. You can volunteer. You can advocate. You can be someone who notices the kid sitting alone. For Grace, that was everything.